welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week we begin our 4-week unit studying Nnedi Okorafor's Binti, the Complete Trilogy, with our discussion of the first novella, Binti, published in 2015. And oftentimes here at the start of an episode, I will take a step backwards. I will step backwards in time, backwards in the book, backwards in our discussion, in order to revisit or frame something that's important. Here, I'm taking the unprecedented step of skipping back to something before the podcast, something in the preparatory material, because before page 1 of Binti, Nnedi Okorafor is challenging and changing the way that I'm thinking about her work. When I outlined this unit and described the 4 candidate books that the Patreon supporters of Stars and Swords could choose between, I described this as a series on BIPOC visions of the future. I chose 2 African-American authors and 2 Indigenous American authors, each of whom offered a different perspective on the future imaginary, not just speculative fiction, not just metaphor, but an actual set-in-the-days-to-come vision of the future. After the poll was completed and Binti was chosen, I, without, it must be said, much thought, started referring to this as an Afrofuturist unit, using the term coined by cultural critic Mark Derry in the 1993 collection Flame Wars, The Discourse of Cyberculture. And parenthetically, if there is a book more 1993 than Flame Wars, The Discourse of Cyberculture, then I haven't heard of it. Okorafor, however, does not use the word Afrofuturist because of the ways that it prioritizes the experiences and perspectives of African Americans rather than Native Africans. She lays out her reasons for this in a blog post from October 2019, in which she introduces the term African Futurist, which not only prioritizes the perspective of African people, but takes that cultural root as the unifying element of the Black diasporic populations. Okorafor writes, quote, "African futurism is concerned with visions of the future, is interested in technology, leaves the earth, skews optimistic, is centered on and predominantly written by people of African descent, Black people, and it is rooted first and foremost in Africa. It's less concerned with what could have been, and more concerned with what is and can/will be. It acknowledges, grapples with, and carries what has been." End quote. She also, in that same post, coins the term African Jujuist, which she doesn't define in as great detail beyond this very evocative sentence. It, quote, "respectfully acknowledges the seamless blend of true existing African spiritualities and cosmologies with the imaginative," end quote, which is heady stuff. That is the kind of sentence that I will just sit quietly with a cup of coffee and think about for an hour. That is to say, I suppose, that African Jujuism is the fantasy that grows from the African imaginary in the same way that European fantasy, which I guess is our default fantasy mode in the Anglophonic world, that European fantasy grows from the shared European imaginary, that melting pot of knights and swords and feudal rule and, misogyny. So with all that said, welcome to our African Futurist unit on Binti, the Complete Trilogy, a bound volume of 3 novellas and a bonus short story published in 2019. Before we begin with the text itself, a brief biography then. Okorafor is born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1974 to Nigerian parents. She completes her undergrad studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, then earns a master's degree in journalism from Michigan State and a master's degree and ultimately a PhD in English from the University of Illinois, Chicago. She begins publishing YA fiction and short stories in 2001 and publishes her first novel for adults in 2011 with Who Fears Death. In 2017, notably, Okorafor starts writing for Marvel Comics, taking over the Black Panther title following the incredibly influential run by Ta-Nehisi Coates. She's won Hugo Awards, and Nebula Awards, an Eisner Award, and the World Fantasy Award in 2011, after which she wrote a really insightful essay reflecting on the award itself, bearing the likeness of the, it must be said, extremely racist H.P. Lovecraft. She also gave a TED Talk in 2017 at TED Global in Tanzania. The talk was entitled, quote, "Sci-Fi Stories That Imagine a Future Africa," end quote, and I give it my most sincere recommendation. The link to that is in the show notes. So all of this might make Binti feel like a somewhat daunting proposition because this is an important work. It is coming from a tradition and a perspective that is highly specific, that is rooted deeply, and is, frankly, unusual for the sci-fi mainstream. But as I've said many times before, books teach you how to read them. And that is particularly true of Binti, which never feels heavy-handed or expository, but demonstrates a real mastery of the details that allow the reader to build out the world. We're going to begin by looking very closely at the first few pages, and then, of course, we must accelerate our reading just a little so that we can look at the story as a whole and cover the novella in a single podcast episode. The opening of the novella is It's simple and clean and human. Quote, I powered up the transporter and said a silent prayer. I had no idea what I was going to do if it didn't work. My transporter was cheap, so even a droplet of moisture, or more likely a grain of sand, would cause it to short. It was faulty, and most of the time I had to restart it over and over before it worked. Please, not now. Please, not now, I thought. End quote. So just in terms of the story's construction, this is a strong opening. It's an intimate POV. We are in our protagonist's head right from the first word. We're introducing a sense of urgency, perhaps even of desperation, which implies stakes to the plot. It's a strong hook to get the reader interested, but looking at the details tells us a surprising amount about the world that is being presented to us. Specifically, a powerful contrast, and this will be the main thematic thrust of the entire book, and it's right here in the first paragraph, a powerful contrast between the material and the spiritual. The first thing that we learn is that the transporter is cheap, that it can be compromised by sand or water. This is a sci-fi world in which technology is physical, material, real. It can break for the most mundane of reasons. This is a pretty common part of modern science fiction, largely a product of the late 1970s, I guess. Star Wars, where technology is worn and unreliable. Ridley Scott's Alien in 1979, which popularizes this vision of a working-class space future. This is often contrasted with the Star Trek vision of the future, where technology is sleek and abstracted and unknowable, which isn't as true as it might seem if you've watched a lot of Trek, but is certainly a fair impression to get from a distance. So to introduce in the first paragraph the idea of a transporter, with all the Star Trek associations of that word, and also the idea that technology is imperfectly suited to its physical circumstances, this is immediately engaging. That, though, isn't the real contrast here, because the real contrast comes in the opposition between this materialist approach to technology, that technology is real and physical and imperfect, and the spiritualist response from our as yet unnamed POV character, who explicitly prays and then voices a more casual, implicit prayer at the end of the paragraph. Please, not now. Please, not now. Our protagonist doesn't offer a technical solution to a technical problem, despite the fact that they clearly understand what is happening. We do not offer a material balance to the problem of technology in this environment. At the same time, the transporter isn't magical, to borrow from Arthur C. Clarke's famous adage about sufficiently advanced technology. It is just a convenient gadget which exists in and is subject to the world, and upon which the hopes of our protagonist rest. It's a strong opening. And it sketches a world of contrast and complexity before we really know anything about the story. We continue this as we move into the second paragraph. The transporter levitates baggage and is, quote, flat as a prayer stone, end quote. Our protagonist whispers a thank you when it works, performing what we might take to be a gesture, or perhaps even a ritual, of gratitude. This is also where we encounter first the word ochize, and even if we don't know what that is, the physicality of the act here is evocative. We're swiping from the forehead, then, quote, grounding the sweet-smelling red clay, end quote. And we can note the ambiguity here in the use of the word grounding, which is casually evocative of grinding, right? To break up and to disperse the clay into the sand, to return it, in a sense, to a more original form. But, of course, it also suggests the grounding of this electrical current, or the returning to earth of something that has been temporarily removed from it. It is intimately connective. So, again, we have the materialist and the spiritualist. We have the reality of the transporter and the ochize and the sand, even the reality of the baggage, which must be carried if our protagonist is going to make it to their destination on time. All that material is connected to, is integrated with the spiritual, the prayer, the reference to the prayer stone, which is itself a combination of the physical and the spiritual, of course, and the power of the red clay ochize upon the head and then upon the ground. We then pull back, mirrored beautifully, actually, in the action of the protagonist straightening up. The camera moves with the protagonist here. We pull back to sketch what is happening. Our protagonist is leaving, is defying tradition, and already, because the specifics have been so vivid, because the connection to the world beyond the self has been so deftly outlined, we can feel the weight of that tradition. Okorafor is leaning here into the main power of speculative fiction, which is to expand the canvas of possibility beyond the real in order to accommodate, to heighten the emotional, intellectual, and philosophical stakes. It would be one thing to have a protagonist leave their home and go to the nearest major city. It would be another to have the protagonist leave their home and go to Paris or New York or Tokyo. but it's casually dropped here that the intention is to leave the entire planet and thus sever fundamentally the connection with the Earth. This is why we have speculative fiction, to give us space to engage with these larger emotional ideas. We close out this section with the transporter working, and with our protagonist noting that, quote, at least some luck was on my side, end quote, which is a different kind of appeal to non-materialism. From there, we board the shuttle, we continue to sketch the contrasts of the world. Our protagonist is ill at ease moving down the aisle of the shuttle because of her hair. Note how the first beat here is, quote, our hair is thick and mine has always been very thick, end quote, anchoring the protagonist's sense of that first-person plural, that our, in her specific community, in her parents and siblings and aunties and uncles, and not, crucially, in the other people aboard the shuttle. We learn, quote, everyone looked as if the sun was his or her enemy. I was the only Himba on the shuttle. So we are anchoring Binti's experience, our unnamed protagonist's experience, in her collective identity as a people, but we are also crucially differentiating her. Our hair is thick, and mine has always been very thick. She is different even within her own community. We contrast the technology of the shuttle with her family home, the organic and brilliantly named The Root, and then we get the core conflict of the novella laid out in fairly clean but still human terms. The Himba don't travel. The Himba are connected to their land. Quote, our ancestral land is life. Move away from it, and you diminish. End quote. At this point, we get our protagonist's name, Binti, in reported dialogue from her mother, which is a really nice touch, a continuity of being and of naming that quietly emphasizes Binti's bonds to her family and her home. And this is also where we are introduced to the Kush, the dominant ethnic group, in the form of an old security officer who scans Binti and appears to be an obstacle, only instead to praise her. Though, here again, he is praising her as the pride of her people in a way that demonstrates a lack of understanding and respect for her people's ways, because if he really knew about her and her people, he would understand that she was not making them proud right now. She is leaving. And Binti understands what the officer does not, as her eyes prick with tears. So, two things. First, Okorafor is refusing here to let the analogy take over the book. Because yes, on some level, Binti is about race. But it is a sincerely African futurist work and is complete and consistent in that intention. That is, the world is built out, per Okorafor's aim, as a complete work of fiction, which also prioritizes African perspectives. This, I think, is realized most fully in the Kush, because, frankly, the cheap way of analogizing this relationship would be to make the Kush white. This, though, is not the case. Instead, the Kush, as implied by their name, by their clothing, by their relationship to the Himba, and as has been made clear by Okorafor's commentary after the fact, the Kush are Arab people. This delineates a contrast, a cultural contrast, between the sub-Saharan African population, which includes the people of Namibia and the Himba people, and the North African Mediterranean coast of Africa, which I guess logically we could describe as super-Saharan Africa, though that does not quite seem right. This is African futurism. We don't resort to a default white colonialist or post-colonialist perspective, either for protagonism or antagonism, because this isn't a story about white people, not even in opposition. This is where we introduce Binti's Idan, an artifact which she discovered in the desert 8 years ago. That is, when she was 8 years old. This is a particularly rich idea, right? That technology can age out of utility and simultaneously descend and ascend into art. There's a cute reflection here almost about technology beginning its existence as the state of the art, only to eventually wind up in a state of art. I love what this does to our understanding of technology's place in an ongoing developmental culture. The other thing to note about the Idan, particularly as it becomes relevant later in the story, is that it is technology, but also, in Binti's experience, it comes from the earth. And she says, when confronted by the security guard, that she carries it for luck. So again, we are enfolding the material and the spiritual in a really complex way. And we're going to continue to do that because it's becoming clear even by this point that although Okorafor is interested in deconstructing this materialist-spiritualist binary, which will remain the most significant thematic frontier in the book, she's consistently rejecting binaries as a default proposition. We can see that, for example, in the treatment of gender, which is both significant but also somewhat sidelined in this first novella. Binti is a girl called by mathematics, a traditionally logical, pedantic, masculine area of expertise, But in Binti's hands, mathematics becomes harmonious, it becomes musical, it becomes a collaborative and generative kind of art derived from the science. We'll circle back to thoughts on harmony and on gender a little later. We get the brief evocative description of the Miri 12 starship, a bioengineered vessel loaded with air-scrubbing plants. Again, biology and technology, the natural and the artificial, presented not as a binary, but as a more complex, interwoven system. And forgive me a tangent here, but all I can think about when I'm considering the third fish the starship Binti travels on is the video game Morrowind. And this is probably because I'm also releasing a podcast this week over on my other show, The Last Star in Hollywood, which I co-host with the brilliant Elizabeth Ray. This week, we're discussing the Tom Cruise movie Oblivion, which, of course, has sent me to thinking about the Elder Scrolls series, because before Skyrim, there was Oblivion, and before Oblivion, there was Morrowind, in which, and this is where this tangent comes full circle, the local residents of Vardenfell hollow out space inside the shells of giant 20 feet tall flea-like creatures called silt striders in order to carry passengers and cargo. It is inventively gross, which is something that can honestly be said about a lot of Morrowind. And I guess a tangent within a tangent, or at least adjacent to another tangent, I have been thinking about the possibility of playing through a video game on a stream, something with a rich game world, and then footnoting that text, that world building, in exactly the way that we do here on Stars and Swords, a little adjacent adventure, I suppose. So if you're interested in hearing me break down the world building or the narrative of Mass Effect or Dragon Age or Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls series at large. I've never played Destiny, but I know there's some wild stuff going on in there. The From Software games or Fallout or The Witcher or World of Warcraft. Get in touch and let me know. Okay, back to the book. This, Binti tells us, is how it all began. There are 12 other passengers, which is itself a fascinating detail because in Eurocentric science fiction, we would immediately be sensitive to the presence of the number 13, and that may be intended here too, but my modest research didn't turn up any significance to the number 13 in Himba culture, so I'm inclined to discount it. And this is one of the things that African futurism can do, is destabilize and make us aware of the cultural baggage that we carry moving into a text. This is also where Binti gives us the tantalizing detail that, quote, "My tribe is obsessed with innovation and technology, but it is small, private, and as I said, we don't like to leave Earth. We prefer to explore the universe by traveling inward as opposed to outward." End quote. What, then, does traveling inward mean? Is it related to the account we get shortly thereafter in which Binti and her fellow passengers engage in a mathematical thought experiment, dividing and dividing the world until lost in the foam of recursive fractals, partly to demonstrate excellence, and partly, as Binti says, to get closer to God? And we'll note the quote marks around God there too, because nothing in this book can be left pure and singular. It all has to be compromised and combined in the most interesting and rich ways. We'll see this later in the novel, this abstracted state in which math, rigorous and unambiguous, devolves into chaotic patterns that seem to unlock an intuition or a deeper layer of understanding or, magic. And the book refuses to allow us to settle into this binary between math and magic, between the material and the spiritual. They are connected, and one offers a gateway to the other. We'll note, too, just to disambiguate something that Okorafor doesn't choose to disambiguate because this is African futurism and isn't dependent on the Eurocentric tradition, but the Himba people have a cultural belief in a monotheistic god. But, as becomes clear right at the end of the book, in fact, the very last time that they are mentioned in this novella, the 7 to whom Binti and her father both pray are ancestor spirits. We introduce Heru so that we can immediately take him away. We're fulfilling the standard steps of the YA narrative here and then cutting it cruelly short, though not before he, as a white person, notably, has transgressed in the most contemporary cultural taboo way and touched Binti's hair. And there isn't space, or indeed, I think, the necessity to catalogue all the many ways in which Binti is objectified and judged for her appearance, right? The racism that runs through the heart of this book is clear and doesn't, I think, need much commentary, though it is interesting to note the way that the book itself de-emphasizes it. It is part of the background music of Binti's existence, of Binti's life, and that itself is fascinating, right? To de-emphasize something can sometimes be as significant as emphasizing something, as it is here. This, though, is where the book plays its most powerful twist, the deliberate subversion of audience expectations, the attack of the Meduse and the death of everyone but Binti. And it's a powerful move to introduce the Meduse for the first time in their action. We get violence and blood and then the name, and get the description a page later. Jellyfish aliens, and I'm realizing right now that autocorrect has done me dirty in my notes here and corrected a typo to give me the phrase Jellyfish Alliance, which simply cannot be allowed. Binti's turn to her Idan for protection is interesting, and it depends in part on how much time you believe is eluded by the scene transition here, because without the demarcated scene break, which you'll remember is called a dinkus, it would seem perhaps a little undermotivated, but we don't know how much time has passed and how much thought Binti has put into whatever it is that is keeping her safe. It may have been seconds, it's much more likely that it is minutes, it could even have been hours. We're introduced to the conflict between the Kush and the Meduse, and we see the subtle propagandistic influence of ideology, the great wave, the attack form of the Meduse and the old conflict. Binti moves into survival mode. She is 14 days into her journey and 5 days out from Umza University. She takes refuge in her small room and she waits out 3 days and, well, how you might interpret this may vary, but she intuits what the Idan is, working her Ujitse into the whorls and the patterns on the surface, fundamentally reconnecting it with the earth, right? Until a button is revealed, and suddenly she can communicate with the Meduse. And we're going to zoom all the way out here to look at what is, I think, the largest thematic dimension of the story, because there's a school of narrative thought, a Marvel movie, CinemaSins, Save the Cat kind of narrative perspective that would demand more consequential transparency here, who would see this as a weakness in the story. We're supposed to just accept that the Idan is uniquely applicable to the exact situation in which Binti finds herself? What is it? Where did it come from? How did it get to the desert? How did Binti find it? Why did Binti find it? How does it work? These are, obvious questions, and no spoilers, but the second novella in the trilogy, which we will read next week, addresses some of those questions directly. But in this book, not only do we leave these questions unanswered, but the book clearly signals that to ask those questions is to think about it in the wrong way. 2 sample quotes here. First, quote, "I shut my eyes and prayed to the seven. I wanted to ask, why did you let this happen? But that was blasphemy. You never ask why. It was not a question for you to ask." End quote. And then when the Idan activates, quote, "And in that moment, deep in my submission, I laid my eyes on my Idan and stared at its branching, splitting, dividing blue fractals. And I saw it. I really saw it. And all I could do was smile and think, how did I not know?" End quote. And this is it. This is the thematic heart of the story. Binti's relationship with her own agency, with the concept of agency, with the idea of doing, right? And there's a strange echo here of one of the most dominant sci-fi fantasy archetypes in the Anglophonic world, and I'm sure, though I don't have the numbers, the entire globe. Years ago, I produced a podcast called Story and Star Wars because there was a time, friends, when it was cool and fun to talk about Star Wars on the internet. My intention was to strip away what we think we know about Star Wars, and more importantly, to strip away what Star Wars insists is true about itself, and really look at the story being told. And much to my surprise, the story of the original Star Wars movie, A New Hope, quietly subverts its own genres and focuses not on domination, not on conquering, not on winning, not on victory, not even on agency. In the closing moments of that film, Luke turns off his targeting computer, he trusts in the Force, he submits to the Force, and he saves the day. The actual story of the original Star Wars movie isn't about Luke and Vader or good versus evil. It is a much quieter story about a young man learning to let go and to find harmony and to exist in the moment. Because when you exist in the moment, cosmologically speaking, things will unfold as they should. The will of the Force is the most important thing. This seems to be, well, if not the exact moral lesson of Binti, then at least a part of the moral framework of Binti, part of the schematic that allows us to see what is good and wholesome and sustainable, and by contrast, what is bad and corrupt and destructive. This is, of course, textual in Binti's role as a harmonizer, first in the construction of the charmingly non-specific astrolabes like future tech cell phone gadgets named for an early tool of the astronomer. I love that detail. And of course, in Binti, when we're thinking about home and culture and integration and belonging and our disconnection from those things, the idea of harmony is a powerful one. Binti talks with Oku, who asks about the Ujitse, which seems to have healing properties. Binti explains how important it is, how it connects her to her home, even stating outright that it is her culture, and that taking it would be like taking her soul. And the implication here is fascinating because this is deftly wrapped around a brief digression on Umzayuni and the possibility of making more Ujitse from the material of that planet, which would apparently be satisfactory. Thus, we see that it is the ritual of the Ujitse, rather than the actual red clay of Binti's homeland, that is significant. Culture is portable. It can be continued. It can be sustained, at least as far as Binti believes, even if the specific object of the culture is transformed or removed. It isn't the red clay that's important. It's what the red clay becomes in Binti's hands and upon Binti's skin. It is culture embodied in the individual rather than blurred through community. And we are led to understand that Binti has not left her culture as she may fear, but rather is her culture. And the sophistication with which this argument is articulated, this perspective is offered, all the while maintaining Binti's partial and incomplete ignorance of this philosophy, I think is really masterfully done. There's also a subtle little twist here that I really like. I've been using materialism throughout this episode in reference to the philosophical school, but here we also acknowledge a kind of consumer-oriented materialism when Oku says, quote, "The chief knows of your people. You have much with you," end quote. It seems unlikely, both from context and from the content of the book, that the chief of the Meduse has any idea about the Himba people or Ochise. Rather, this seems to be a generalized claim about the human beings that the chief has encountered, presumably Kush, carrying much with them. The Meduse, by contrast, don't seem to have possessions in the same way. They don't wear clothing or carry technology, though Binti notes when she's aboard the Meduse vessel that, quote, "These people had deep, active technology built into the walls, and many of them had it running within their very bodies. Some of them were walking astrolabes. It was part of their biology," end quote. So is this idea of possessing things, this assertion that you have much with you, is this specific to Binti, or is it a generalized claim about human beings? Well, I'm going to assume the latter because it better fits the information presented, and because I appreciate the thematic point. Remember that when she first gets to the ship, Binti notes that her fellow students gather in her room because it is empty compared to theirs. I'm going to pause here and shift gears just to note something that, well, I don't think that this is particularly significant in the sense of the book's narrative power, but it is just delightful. Oku's dialogue, written in the voice of this belligerent, spoiled child, is so good. In fact, all of the dialogue in the book, often so different from the default narrative voice, is, I think, very strong. It is clear, it is packed with character and with perspective, but every time Oku offers a matter-of-fact declaration like, "I wish I could kill you," or "You are probably the most evil of your people," I am here for it. It's at this point that we learn the Medusa's purpose, taking the ship and breaching the security of the university so that they can reclaim the stinger of their chief, an artifact of significance that has been taken from its rightful place and displayed as a treasure. This is obviously a post-colonialist rhetorical maneuver, but note what Okorafor is doing here. Anchoring the theft in the body of the chief once again ties the material and the spiritual together, or more specifically, in this case, the physical and the cultural, right? It is the chief's body, and the chief is particularly significant because of its role in Meduse society. Binti makes the theme of harmony textual as we move toward the meeting with the chief. We get the great introduction to the interior of the Meduse ship, and you'll note that this is where Binti slips and begins referring to the Meduse as people. And then she flashes to the Kush, who created her breathing mask and scented it like flowers, a decision as strange and alien, or I guess, at least predicated upon a perspective, a culture, an ideological framework that is just as strange and alien, just as far from the scentless flowers of the desert. Let's pause here to consider carefully Binti's words to the Meduse chief. And remember, this is her opening gambit. This is the first thing she says after prostrating herself. Quote, "My people are the creators and builders of astrolabes," I said. "We use math to create the currents within them. The best of us have the gift to bring harmony so delicious that we can make atoms caress each other like lovers. That's what my sister said." I blinked as it came to me. "I think that's why this Adan works for me. I found it in the desert. A wild woman there once told me that it is a piece of old technology. She called it a godstone. I didn't believe her then, but I do now. I've had it for 5 years, but it only worked for me now." End quote. So, what do we make of that? It's a useful bit of insight as far as it goes, and we get the layering of Binti's instinct for harmonious integration, explaining the consequences of her instinct for harmonious integration, but as a rhetorical strategy, it's a little strange. She has a plan. She goes into the meeting with the chief with a plan to act as an ambassador and negotiate a peace. But she begins with the Adan, with the explanation of what Oku describes as her shame, this thing that can harm the Medusa. And this, I think, is the thing. She's consciously or unconsciously drawing upon the most powerful and demonstrable proof of her talent, of her nature, to circumvent the formalities, the social requirements of this meeting, to get right to the heart of the matter. That ability to see through the facade and connect with what is true might be seen as the root of Binti's skill with harmonies. We'll return to this idea in next week's show, but I'm really interested in the way in which Binti navigates her own realizations and understandings of the world around her. She surrenders her Adan to the Medusa and is stabbed. The death is, of course, metaphorically heavy, as is the recovery, laid out in her room covered in ojitse. What's most important as Binti wakes and they land on Umzayuni is that she can now understand Oku without the use of the Adan. She has harmonized with it, though we don't yet know the full measure of that change. While leaving the ship, she remembers visiting a lake and washing off her ojitse, and thus confirms the other kind of cultural pressure that people in general experience. Shame, judgment, devaluation in the eyes of your community if you do not behave well. This is the way that all cultural standards are applied. The positive pressure of identity, of belonging, and the negative pressure of punishment. And of course, every single aspect of culture exists first to perpetuate that culture. So conformity is a major factor. But again, here, Okorafor is subtly distinguishing between the cultural and the personal, because there is no sense that when Binti washes off her ojitse back in the lake, that she became a different person. And the reason that we're bringing this story up now, of course, is to accommodate philosophically the space for her own transformation, which has already happened, though she herself has not realized it yet. Binti addresses the professors of the university, and they agree, eventually, to return the stinger, emphasizing their own cultural qualities as they do so: honor, respect, wisdom, and knowledge. But most importantly, this is the point where Binti learns that harmonizing with the Medusa has transformed her, again demonstrating this connection between the material and the spiritual. This is really the final movement of the novella, bringing us through the reaction of the students and the professors of the university to Binti's new appearance and the manner of her arrival. She confronts the change within her body, and we move through the ritual creation of this new ojitse and the final reintegration with her community, first with Oku, then with her family, as she reaches out and calls her mother. The change of spirit will be reflected in the change of body and vice versa. But after the change, we have harmonization and reintegration and reconnection. Personal identity comes first, but it doesn't endure on its own. Everything is connected. Well, almost everything. Here's a little exercise left for the reader, but I find myself curious about the pilot of the third fish, who we're told is left alive by the Medusa and who is glimpsed by Binti on her way off the ship. Oku is clear when he's talking with Binti, quote, "We can fly this creature ship," it said, "but your pilot can speak to the people on Umzayuni in the way they expect." It paused, then moved closer. "See? We never needed you." End quote. And I'm curious, what is the coercive power that is being leveraged against the pilot? He isn't necessary to the physical function of the ship, if we believe what Oku says, and it's clear, given their actions on the third fish, if nothing else, that the Medusa are going to slaughter the students and the faculty of Umzayuni if they arrive, and maybe we can even speculate that the pilot would have revealed the deception at the last moment and died a heroic death as the defenses of the university planet destroy the third fish, and chooses not to because of his faith in Binti's plan. But it's soft, it's speculative, it's an opportunity to look at the ways in which people interact with violence and war from a different perspective that is left untapped by Okorafor, and I find that particularly interesting. Anyway, that's the concluding thought, and it's not even really criticism, just a loose end in a novel that is otherwise a very tight piece of plotting. Next week, we're going to cover the second novella in the trilogy, Home, in which Binti returns to Earth and learns more about her heritage, complicating her own understanding of who she is. The reading schedule is over on the website, starsandswords.com. Next week, Home. The following week, The Night Masquerade. And then for the first episode in August, we're going to cover Sacred Fire, the short story accompanying the novellas in the collected edition. And then we'll do a little wrap-up Q&A in that same episode. So if you have questions, thoughts, ideas, get in touch. starsandswordspod@gmail.com or use the handy-dandy contact page over on the website, which I am about to add any minute now, I swear. Before we wrap up, a quick update on the polls for the next couple of units that we are going to study here on Stars and Swords. We're beginning with a unit on metatextuality in comics, looking at how these long-running universes wrestle with their own internal chronology and canonicity. And as of this recording, Brian Michael Bendis' 2000s reboot Ultimate Spider-Man is currently ahead of Grant Morrison's late 80s spiral into self-awareness Animal Man. But there is still time, so if you'd like to cast your vote, or if you're interested in Marv Wolfman's original and apocalyptic Crisis on Infinite Earth series from 1985, or Kurt Busiek's absolutely beautiful Marvels from 1994, pledge your support at patreon.com/nextword and cast your vote. After we discuss comics, we'll be moving into our dedicated J.R.R. Tolkien unit, and right now, the Silmarillion is just ahead of Baron and Luthien with a little support for Beowulf and no love for Tree and Leaf, which is such a lovely book. So, as of right now, we're gearing up for around 20 weeks of Silmarillion discussion, which will carry us, and brace yourself, will carry us all the way to the new year. Unless I decide to take a break in the middle and cover something spooky for October, which isn't impossible, we'll see how that scheduling shakes out. Stars and Swords is a Next Word podcast, and if you would like to help me make more shows, then please consider pledging a few dollars a month over at patreon.com/nextword. In return, sure, you'll get access to the polls, you'll get access to the bonus episodes, you'll get access to all the other fun stuff that I make and post over there, you'll get access to the Discord server where you can chat and hang out with me through the week, as well as with the brilliant Next Word community. Sure, you get all that, but you know what you really get? My sincere and effusive gratitude. Also, if you have a moment to leave a rating and a review on your podcast app of choice, please do. It's the only way to grow the Stars and Swords audience and to encourage me to make more shows. That's going to do it for this week. I'll talk to you again soon, and as always, I believed I could only be great if I were curious enough to seek greatness. Thanks for listening.